What is up? Super Tuesday, what's going on, everybody? Cedrus, coming back at it. It's time to get more. And tonight we've got a very special Lebanese cedar for you guys, talking about the concept of how do we take this tree, maximize its potential as a bonsai, carry it into the realm of Lebanese cedar, Cedrus Lebanii?
Libani.
Yeah. Lebanii or
no, just
Lebananii?
One of those. It's
Okay.
actually, it is just Cedrus Libani.
Oh, it's Cedrus Lebanii.
Yeah, I looked it up.
Ha!
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Growing, designing,
I was
understanding, build your skills. Sam's already taught us how to improve this design. We're going to be implementing some of her ideas. She has officially started to master the art of bonsai. Pretty cool. Okay, so this is a tree that was cultivated in the Central Valley of California. It is part of the Clark Bonsai collection, permanent piece in that collection. And you saw a Clark collection piece with the Mirai pine. This is a tree originally, and I do believe for the longevity of its lifespan, grown by a very prominent Central Valley bonsai practitioner named Howard Latimer. Sorry, I don't know why Harold keeps jumping out. Anyways, Howard Latimer, had the pleasure to meet Howard when I was at the Golden State Bonsai Federation convention in, I believe, 2003. Shinji Suzuki was the guest artist there and really enjoyed my conversations with Howard. Nice to have a piece perpetuating his legacy. And the goal with this was to try and create a true blue Lebanese cedar. It was completely root bound. It hadn't really been touched in terms of style in a long time. And one of the iconic parts of that initial styling and my connection to the Lebanese cedar being a high elevation tree, accumulation of snow, but also this very vertical growth habit of all of its limbs was to try and mesh those two. And one of the mistakes I made in the original design was to conceptualize the fact that the canopy, being alpine and the way that young Lebanese cedar grow, very pointed in its nature. And then having done the study on the inspiration of this actual species and dug deeper into the ancient forms of these, recognizing that the apex actually becomes quite broad. These really pointed, sort of almost slightly drooping branches characteristic of the Cedrus in Lebanon, and just some nuances that I think we can continue to improve upon on this tree. So I'm going to give you a rotation. We're going to talk about some of the limitations and the things that we're dealing with. We're going to dive into some of the inspirational images from the Cedars of God, which is what the old grove growth in Lebanon is called. And then we're going to go ahead and dig into the improvement and evolution of this design. So engage closely as we rotate. Let's just take a look. I'll go through a couple times. You'll notice the tangled root mass that is very indicative of a nursery-bound container tree, circling roots formed. They are very mature. We will have to rectify that issue over the course of time in successive repottings. And you'll also recognize and notice very common structure, I would say, for a tree that was grown as a piece of nursery material. The lower limbs very lateral in their nature, which is also true to form for Cedrus. But in that, we do have a piece of inverse taper here in the center of the trunk that is a lot more visible from some locations than others, led to a little bit of a design limitation, okay? You can also see we have a very significant base on one side. When we get to this back side, we lose a lot of that quality, and that started to create, with the concept of that inverse taper and the presence of a more formidable, age-appropriate base versus one that's lacking a lot of that, started to paint our ideas around the front of the tree. But inside of our initial guess at that front, it was originally repotted before it was ever styled. And we know that if we repot before styling, chances are we're going to miss it. We do have to combat the same length being on the left as we have on the right. And this is a major part of tonight's design discussion. Now, before I can dive into all of the ideas that I want to evolve with this tree, let's just take a moment to key into some ancient forms of Lebanese cedar and really try to pull out some of the nuances. Now, I'm going to talk you guys through this and what I'm getting from these images that I want to execute on this tree. But let's go ahead and blast into that gallery. Josh is going to give us a little bit of time as we roll through it. And we're just going to start with image number 1, which is a very, very beautiful younger iteration. But inside of this younger iteration, you'll notice the planular nature of the branching. You'll see that common up, out, and up form again, but notice how narrow the apex of these younger cedars are in this grove. Go ahead and go to the next one, Josh. Okay, so this is a really beautiful view of one of the ancient Cedars of God from underneath it. And you see that upward growing habit. Notice how it up and arcs out. But then look at the way that the branching angles. It forms its acute crotch in the major primary and secondary branches. But we also have some obtuse crotches up in there. We see how the branches sort of intertwine and intermingle together and occupy that space. And then look at the tips of the branches and how they fan out. And notice that slight triangular fan there. Notice how that almost is an arrowhead shape to that big foliar mass that sits right above the negative space of the sky there. Interesting pieces to take out of this observation. Let's see the next one. Okay, so now we have a much more stripped down iteration, and we talk about those quantifying components of that movement from young to old to ancient. We quantify that by a more dramatic degree of asymmetry. We talk about that by a greater prevalence of negative space. Typically, we would say remnants of what was, but as you look up into this trunk, notice that there's flush cuts on these branches. It would appear as though this tree may have been a tree that existed in a high traffic area where they were probably cutting off the dead limbs for the safety of people hiking or walking. Or I have no idea what the context is around this because it's not that safe to go see the cedars in Lebanon in the current climate of the area of the world where they exist. But nevertheless, you see that spreading canopy, you see some of those notions of the designs we're talking about, and you see the flattening off of the crown now here in sort of this more ancient iteration. Let's see this next one. Okay, so I think that this piece is an incredibly inspiring piece that exists in terms of its relationship to this tree. You notice the big prominent branch on the left. You also notice the big prominent branches on the right. You see some of the verticality that exists in the secondaries in the trunk, a real prominent base. And I think inside of the tree that we're looking at, you see that trunk that's kind of on the left side of the tree, very significant and thick, and it's in relation to the primary trunk. That would be the dead piece that we're almost seeing inside of the current iteration of this Lebanese cedar in the studio tonight. But seeing that tree form, the verticality that forms the apical region off of that leftward branch, the length and the extension, the width that's established, but again, coming back to this notion of that flatter crown. And one thing that we can see in this as well is notice how all of the pads start to form these flat little layers that just kind of dance through the canopy. This is, I think, a very quintessential aspect of Cedrus as it grows in the natural environment. Okay, so this, an old film shot, and it was super fun seeking out these images. Copyright-free images, free use images is what we were limited to, and that's completely acceptable. At some point, I do aspire to get to this grove if it becomes a little more accessible point in the world. Notice the flattening of the upper apical region. This is really where, when I started looking at these images, I knew immediately I'd missed it in the first iteration of the design. And seeing the layers that are forming, seeing the up-out movement that forms those layers, and even when we look at the most prominent branch as we move up from the base on the right side of the tree, and you move out in that really long asymmetrical direction to the right, notice the branches coming up off of that as secondary pads, forming these different layers both vertically above the branch, lateral with the branch, and some of them dropping down below the branch. There's opportunity here in terms of design to kind of play on this theme. Okay, we get into some of that understory growth, and again, the real visual impact of this piece as we look at the lowest branch on the right that extends towards the right boundary of the photograph. And notice how you see the branch drop down, and then at any bend where it starts to drop, even if it's on the inside halfway out that branch, you see just a small arcing line up that creates a pad, obviously in a depth-filled background capacity. You move a little bit out, and right as that primary structure drops down, we've got that secondary coming off of that elbow and occupying a space as a secondary pad. This is a concept for how we break up a singular branch into multiple foliar masses as it pertains to a cedrus, but this also applies to other trees. A really beautiful illustration of how we start to take a simple structure with a limited number of branches and create multiple pads out of that very simple structure to add more complexity to the design. Okay, here we see two trees. Now notice the environment that these are growing in. Seemingly very dry, alpine. You can see the snow and the misty mountains behind them, but you have this up and out. You've got these multiple pads. We see the repetition of concept now playing through several of these renditions and iterations of older trees. And this is where we get the consistency, where we're not just justifying a one-off approach to one random tree that we see, but we're seeing consistencies within the species that we can pull in aesthetically into the creation of this piece. I think this is a wonderfully beautiful illustration of their growth habit. Okay, and then we see this piece. Now, I am not totally sold that this is a Lebanese cedar. I wonder if this might not be a blue atlas cedar. It was under the Lebanese cedar category, but they do share some similarities in terms of elevation and snow load, etc. Now, we're not seeing the total height of this tree, but we get a little bit more of the out at the upper canopy, longer branches up top. We come back into that space where we've seen branches lost. We move back out, this is along the right side of the tree, back out into those middle ground branches, and we start to see all of those dynamics that we've identified play out in some of the lowest pieces, forming those multiple pads on a singular dropping branch. So seeing the upright growth habit, the upward growth habit, the up and out growth habit, and the down and out and down growth habit, all things we can tap into as we start to increase complexity in the design of this tree. Okay, giving you some context for the environment and the fact that when we start to see a heavy snow environment in alpine with broader canopies, very interesting, either means that the surface area of the leaf mass is not very large, which we know on these, the needles are quite thin. They do accumulate to form a large surface area, but obviously they need to be flexible to a degree to shed the snow and not become more narrow as we would see in a spruce. But I think beyond that, you also notice there's a lot of small twigs, dead branches, stubs, snags, etc. in there, which is quite fascinating to observe. Okay, and you can see a sense of scale for when we get to ancient with the people in this image. And I felt like this is important to really start to paint the notion of grandeur that the Cedars of God have. You can see that they're in snow. There's a big boulder leaning against this tree. But again, we echo some of those. And notice that this tree has lost its central apical region, which is a theme to a degree of the tree that we're working with the dead piece that exists. And then we'll finish off with the Lebanese flag. Now, before I had approached the design on this tree, I had leaned hard on the Lebanese flag. The Lebanese cedar, major cultural influence in Lebanon, major influence in terms of religious and spiritual connotation, just a very pivotal part of culture. And the Cedars of God are dying. They've been burned multiple times for reasons of warfare and starvation of resources. But the peaked, really pointed top of this, I do believe, was the piece I took when I was trying to create the apex of this tree. And having seen the trees in their iterations, my guess is that this was an interpretation of probably the broader, younger form that was captured in this flag formation, and something that we can improve upon, I think, in the design currently to really max it out. So anyways, really, really interesting to get to dive into the design concepts of Lebanese cedar. And when we're trying to tease out some of those components, trying to find the repetitive existence of character, not that we have to justify our designs, but seeing those things that we can really grab onto, lock onto, and duplicate as a thematic carrying through of design, I think is an important part of interpreting the natural environment when we go to reflect it in a bonsai form. So let's get to this tree and the challenges that exist. Now, we know the base is definitely giving us our best potential tree from this side. And Eve's going to show you guys that base. You'll see the very contorted, kind of tied up roots that exist as a result of being pot-bound in nursery cultivation. Now, if we zoom back out, we're going to see that we do have a little bit of a challenged branch structure in terms of this, because even though these two branches don't occur at the same level, what we do have is we have a very similar length here to a very similar length here, and we have a very similar plane here. We also have a very similar plane across the top of these pieces. This is one of the things I think we need to greatly improve upon. And with that similar length and the apex almost evenly distributed between them, we reach that point of symmetry and we see youth in the design. And it's impossible, almost impossible when you repot first to be able to offset these things because you're focused on all the things around repotting. We came back and designed it once and it was very clear we had some things that we needed to work through. Now we're here again with the tree having matured on that a little bit to really bring it to fruition. Okay? Now the trunk is relatively straight, but when we potted it the first time, my concern, not having styled it yet, was that this branch on the left, if we inclined it any more, was going to be very perpendicular. Where I'm at now, considering the concepts of the tree, if I don't shorten this here, if I don't change this plane, if I don't shift this line through the design, it's going to be very, very difficult to execute this tree on the scale of referential to that ancient form. And so before we started the stream, Sam was talking about that trunk feels kind of lackluster as it exists. What happens if you change the angle? And let's just kind of explore this. I changed it in 2 planes. And it is that heavy. I changed it in 2 planes to kind of start to play with that notion. Now, one of the things we might say is, well, now these are actually closer in terms of proximity. Be careful because this drops this down and we can use some of those downward pointing branches to start to tap into some of that ancient. But what we also said is in order to pull on this proportion, we've got to reduce the width. And that's where we start to say, man, could I cut this off? But I think when we start to talk about cutting this off, we lose some of those nuances of that upward form, whereas we've taken these out and we've taken some down. I think this gets pulled in by going up and in and really starts to push in this greatest amount of length to be able to execute that. This is where I'm going to begin the process of revamping the structure with a singular line, tapping into that design nuance, and starting the process of reconceptualizing. Pad formation, I want to make them dance. Length, I want that pointed formation and I want that length to exist. Apical region, we see where we can clarify this design by lowering that and spreading that out as that ancient form. With those themes, let's engage in a redesign and really dig in. I'm going to open it up to questions as I execute this very first move.
Leonard wants to know, what about carrying the deadwood down from the center dead branch to give more of an illusion of taper?
Could potentially be an option. I think the real kind of indication of swelling, though, is in the width that has formed here. And carrying this down, I don't know that it's going to take the width away without the addition of negative space. And so would we, and any time that we start to try and improve upon a design notion like this for a tree that is extremely old, we have to start to look at, are we going to be able to change it in the way that would actually address the issue? So if we created that artificial piece, it's healed up, it's got great callus formation, it has an older form of deadwood appearance to it, and the tree has adapted to it, are we going to be able to improve it by cutting into that callus and starting to change that shape and form? I don't know that it satisfies or solves the actual issue, which is the thickening of the living tissue, not necessarily the presence of the deadwood. And I don't think that we have the ability, at least not in this iteration, to remove this branch on the left or remove the branch on the right. That could be a part of the continued process over the course of time if we started to really get into that asymmetrical model and pulling on the base as we continue to improve the root mass.
David wants to know, what branch is the most significant one?
Good question. What branch is the most significant? I don't know. I don't know quite yet. Let's see if we can work our way into that. Now, just with that move, notice how that pulled that up. Notice how it occupied the space so that we started to break up some of that continuum, right? That's a really, just seeing it up now, as I start to look at this, that really did give us a reduction here, starts to push the tree a little bit more there, and we're really looking for that movement in this direction. I like how that changed it. I like how the tilt elevated this upper foliar mass on the upper right here and exposed this negative space. And let's kind of start to tease out in these branches here some of those more triangular nuances to see if we can define in this exploratory piece, not the defining branch for sure. I think we're over there with that, but let's just kind of tease out some of this exploration. Now, getting into this, Jesus, if you can just zoom in closely here, we're going to take a look at the growth habit of Cedrus and how we start to deal with that, okay? We can see where the tip was pruned in May before it came up to Mirai. You can see that you have 2 opposing branches here. You can see that you have 2 opposing branches here. you can see that you have very close to opposing branches here, and then we get into a vertical and some of these smaller pieces back in the back. Now, if I want that elongated form here, I want that pointed form, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take out those short stubby pieces. I'm going to shorten one of these two pieces, and if I want that form visible from the front, I'm going to use the longest piece that's closest to the front. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to shorten this. Now, Jesus, can you zoom in just on this shoot? Let me get this in here. Just on this shoot. Okay. All right. So when we look at Cedrus, you'll notice, much like the hemlock that we did the refinement pruning on, you have buds in the axis or in that crotch where the needle connects to the stem, and you have a lot of them, okay? Now you have this very long, elongated internode right here from where it originated this year at the tip of my scissor, long internode with no buds, and then we start to get into this multitude of buds. This elongated internode, very similar to a larch in that it had all the stored sugars and starches from last spring. Its first big push of growth, that internode elongated, and then we start getting into a reduction of that sugar starch storage, generating tighter internodes and closer ramification. Now again, if we want that pointed nature of it, we can deal with this, but if we're going to come back and shorten, I could shorten literally to any of these needles that have a bud in the crotch, all the way back, trying to avoid pruning the needles if possible because it'll leave an unsightly dead needle, so I've got a bud there. Or if I want to really shorten it, I can shorten it back to the buds that exist all the way on the interior here and get that compaction of that so that I have a very short piece. Now I can take my wire and redirect it out to this longer piece, just giving it the general directional insinuation, not trying to overly tighten and control the wire around this tip, giving it that kind of nice drooping pointed formation. Yeah, and now I'm going to start to come back, and with that tip formed, I'm going to carry that structure of that triangular form back in and through this region of these branches, try to create a little bit of depth in the foreground here, and start to actualize that pad formation that we saw as a kind of thematic continuum in those trees that we looked at. Okay, so I'm just going to go through here and prune this real quick, see if we can't get this nice and started.
Don't have any more questions right now, but we have some nice design commentary. Andrew says that he sees a beautiful natural design removing all the branches left of the deadwood, having some foliage poke out behind the deadwood.
Sure.
Sarah thinks that the tilt made the gin look more believable. David thinks the most significant branch is the branch on the right.
On the right. I think the branch on the right is kind of our, I think it's our guiding light. I think it's that defining component that we're looking for. And I think really these pads have gotten big and round. And the last thing that we see in Cedrus, at least in the Lebanese cedar, in terms of its growth habit, is big round pads. We kind of see these thin pads that trail off into these longer pieces. And that's really where we're trying to pull back the design to start to execute a little bit more of that nuance that we teased out of those photos. And again, you know, talking about trying to suss out design and tease out design in a tree and only having images to go off of, we can only be so accurate, because I think part of knowing a tree and knowing design is having been there and experienced that region and that environment and really seeing that design in an ancient form in person. That leaves us with a more lasting impression. But you can see also how the Lebanese flag kind of left me or led me in a direction that was a little bit less accurate towards the more ancient form that this material clearly has the characteristics to start to tap into. And that's our focus tonight, is to regain that form of ancient. And I think inside of this, just talking about the nuances of Cedrus in terms of, in these branches, we've got all of these, what we would call spurs. So Jesus, can you kind of focus into this piece right here? Okay, all of these little spurs right here, which a spur, much like with a larch, you see it grow just this tuft, but it doesn't necessarily elongate. Now that doesn't mean that there's not a bud inside of that tuft that can't elongate, but basically these are on the interior, and then you see the pieces that have a little bit more foliar mass built up and have probably been pruned or controlled in here that have a different orientation. They've got a lot more needle mass. These are our elongating pieces that give us length. We need those spurs for density, and if we need to pull on those spurs, we do have the ability to stimulate the growth of those spurs by pruning back to them. But if we can focus our energy on some of these elongating pieces and really start to tease out that triangular nature of the growth habit, I think we're going to be more successful in our design process. Now, when I come back to the main camera and we start to talk about the front, we see that rounded nature of that branch, and we kind of see this slope right here. I want to take this slope down. I want this slope to be nice and sharp in terms of the aesthetic that I'm executing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reduce some of these high points here. Again, pruning back to buds as much as I possibly can. Let me go ahead and pull this over here. I'll be greedy with the tree. Okay, I'm going to take off these pieces growing towards the interior that might give us a little bit more depth and that kind of fuller content. And then when I start to look in here, some of these foreground pieces that I was just talking about with those spurs, if I start to take those off, I start to reduce some of the weight and the bottom growing pieces that are giving us a lot of width in terms of top to bottom. I can start to really thin this down and just kind of tease my way through this, finding how do we really maximize that aesthetic that we're trying to capitalize on in terms of Cedrus, because it is a little bit of a nuanced piece, okay? So I'm even going to come in here and I'm going to eliminate this vertical height. Jesus, can you show them this? Okay, I'm going to eliminate some of this vertical height. I'm going to create a little contour in here, but I'm really flattening this pad out as much as I possibly can to try and create those dancing levels of foliar mass. We've now gotten this triangular form, we've gotten this triangular form, and this is starting to feel a little bit more like I want that Cedrus to feel. Let's see it from the wide shot and just compare it. Yeah, that's giving us that nice sharpness. See that sharpness here, that low profile? I feel really good about that. Okay, and we have to explore, tease out those nuances when we first start this. We're functioning off of themes that we drew from those images to really be able to build the best possible iteration of this tree as we come back and work it and grow our design knowledge of the species, okay? Now, as I come up into here, I've got this really rounded pad that exists right in here. And again, that rounded nature is not what makes it feel like a cedar. We want that pointed nature. I've got some great length out in here. I wonder if I even come in and potentially remove some of this foreground, not all of it, because it would leave a dramatic insight into the structure of the branches. We don't want to show necessarily the structure at the tips. We want to show it more on the interior and that big lateral and then vertical branching. But I think I can pull this back a little bit, shorten a little bit, and start to create some more nuanced shape in terms of this interior, always pruning back to those pieces that are growing at bud sites that exist to get the reduction of those, and really closing down that vertical height. I don't want the pads to get super thick. Let's keep them thin and show that scale, show that proportion by reducing those into those really lateral flat masses.
Leonard Wood wants you to identify again how far from the buds you're cutting.
How far from the buds I'm cutting. Let me get back into that. That's a really great question, because do we cut right up against them? Does Cedrus have a hard time healing? Does it die back if we cut too short? And so let me get in here to a shortened region. I'll prune back to a junction here, and then let me rotate this to Jesus, okay? So when I start to look at cutting these, I've got this big extended area. Can you see this, Jesus? Okay, and say I want to shorten this dramatically. Now I have a bud right here. I've got a bud right here in the elongating stem. If I'm going to cut to it, I'm very, very happy to bring my scissors in between the needles. And forgive me, I'm functioning on a little bit of a weird angle here to show you guys this, okay? And I can cut right up against that bud that exists and not worry. If I just show you that, you see the bud is very close to that cut site. I'm not at all worried about damaging that bud. We can always leave a little bit more space, but if you leave more space, you're going to have more twigs to come back in and correctively prune. So I'm always capable of coming back in here, getting right in between those needles, and boom, cutting right close to the bud. I'm not worried about damaging it. Now you'll notice some of these shoots start to incline downward, so they're on the bottom portion of that branch. These are the pieces that when I come back in to improve and correct those bar branchings that are being created, I can go ahead and eliminate those, and it really slenders down the profile of that branch. It starts to make it a lot more elegant in terms of its form. And you can see just in terms of that pruning how we narrow that out and really start to get some beauty inside of that. Now when we jump into the interior here, notice that I've got vertical pieces that are barring. Can you see that, Jesus? Okay, so I got one on top and one on the bottom. Well, this becomes easy. I'm going to take that piece off of the bottom there to start to clean up and reconcile that lower area. I've got a piece down here that's growing to the interior and towards the bottom, and I've got a piece here that's growing aggressively vertically. I take all of those off, and it just creates that space that starts to execute that proportion and that scale. So a lot of different nuances to how we're handling this, but all of them thematically play on the same design concepts, okay? I've got a really weak branch inside here. When we start to see weaker branches on Cedrus and they're surrounded by such significantly stronger branches, I have no problem going ahead and shedding them. They're going to create the space that we're looking for to execute a little bit more of that concept of age. And it was also very structurally flawed. You see how close it was to this piece, and this branch is very important. I can now kind of flirt some of these over to occupy that space, but I'm also welcome. I'm totally welcoming and accepting of this space as a fundamental part of the design of Cedrus, knowing that they play on that division of all of these different elongating pieces. Now, I may choose to leave this piece elongated into this space, and next year I may choose to pinch the tip to stimulate these buds in the back to start to grow, or maybe just prior to it starting to grow, I would prune right here to stimulate those buds. But for now, if I want to accumulate the energy in those buds, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave that tip on there if I need it to occupy this space and stimulate that growth via that pinching or pruning next season.
Let's see. So Paul asks, if you don't cut back to a bud, will new buds form from the cut site, or will you have a dead branch?
You'll have a dead branch. And this is a very common aspect when we start to talk about a lot of our elongating species. Spruce, we cut back to a bud. Hemlock, we cut back to a bud. Fir, Doug fir, or true ABs, we have to cut back to a bud, or else that's a dead tip. We may get a bud back in, or this is where those spurs that we talked about really start to become functional as units of growth in a Cedrus, almost like a insurance policy, if you will. If these are growing in the alpine, people have also said, commonly asked, why does spur growth exist in larch? I don't know, and I don't know that anybody's ever quantified that, but if you think about the alpine region and the ability for a late frost to knock off really soft, susceptible growth, all of a sudden those spurs are there, not consuming a lot of energy immediately, but with the potential to grow, and contrary to popular belief that they will not grow, they absolutely will grow if there's not another oxenfilled dominant tip to take over, okay? So that kind of pulls this back, and it also gives us a little bit of this pointed nature. I'm going to drop some of this down and start playing with those levels of verticality and steps inside of that foliar mass. And I love this, but notice how thick. And see how this rounds out to that pad? I want to tap into that and just start taking that height out of these pieces back to a bud, take these height out of these pieces back to a bud, and try as hard as I can to get that height decreased in that pad so that I start to get that triangular formation here as well as here to execute that aesthetic and that theme that we saw really born in those images. That feels dramatically better, okay? So this is going to be the nature of the work for pruning, but let's come back and see, are there other structural moves we need to make in terms of that guy wire to improve the design? And this is really where I was focused before we started the stream. I think I can compress here just a little bit, or maybe even go up just a little bit. I don't know which one. I feel like if we go up, there's some magic here. I feel like if we go down, there's some magic here. There we go. And now that starts to get a little bit more of this. We've got the ability to go wide. I like that, okay? I see a major issue right here, okay? Because we almost have a duplication. Pad here, central, directly over each other, same width, space. This is a little bit unnatural feeling. It feels a little bit contrived. Do we go vertical with this? Do we come up and then come down? Okay, do we narrow this down a little bit to open up space and give direction to this side? That feels like that might be potential. Do we even potentially conceptualize losing one of these and showing this middle area where we have all of this interest? I'm curious. Do you guys want to see more of that area? That feels really good to create a thoroughfare for our viewpoint to those more ancient forms of the tree. Let us know what you think on chat. I'll keep kind of moving through the design, but that feels like a definitive piece that we could add to the composition. Okay, and then when we get over here, I think this is where we start to take advantage of the ability to drop. Because now when we drop, we start to create this undulating characteristic that we saw in those. And that means that any time I form this downward movement, I can carry this up as a pad that comes off of that downward movement. We saw this in those images of those interior and lower branches, this kind of nuanced formation of pads as a result of that drop. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take out some of the clogging nature of growth here, come back off. Okay, and then I'm going to take this down to start to create that triangular pad. Let me know what they say, Sam.
Yeah, everybody's kind of saying the space below works well. From Kim, Farley says definitely take it out, show more deadwood. Rich says lose it. Rafi says he's not sure, but there's a straight line right off the middle trunk line to the right, but we probably just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We have a couple, but yeah, everybody, all the messages come in and say get rid of it.
Get rid of it.
I agree.
I thought that you guys would be amenable to that. Let's go ahead and take it out and see what happens. Okay, now, when we talk about valuable deadwood in a cedrus, we're talking about deadwood that are big structural pieces off of the trunk, okay? So when I take this off, I'm not gonna wanna leave a squiggly kind of generic young branch here. If I wanna show old, that has to echo through the fact that the deadwood is old. Now, there are some people that would say, well, why can't you show a young branch as if it just died? I think it's a fascinating concept to show the different scopes of time frame that our design is playing over. But I'm going to say if we want this to look as old as we're trying to get it to, or if we want to take that next step, we can stick with a little bit of an older creation of deadwood and not necessarily mimic so much the younger iterations that it might have, okay? So that takes that out. Let me drop this down here.
Yeah, Sarah says she thinks the base of the gin feels too wide for the size of the trees, so strategic foliage placement kind of covers it. That might be kind of what you're doing right now. Leonard says, how about creating negative space in the rearward branch on the right, which would showcase the pad on the left?
I think the rear branches are going to need to be addressed pretty significantly. And again, this tree is relatively wired and relatively beautifully styled. And so it's not like we're coming through and we're undoing everything that was done, but I think we do have the ability to enhance it with the increased knowledge that we have. And that's really the focus tonight, just to take what we have and further, continue to carry it forward. Okay, so this is where I see some of that opportunity. Now, this can be our first attempt. This can be our first attempt at that more cedrus formation of an apex, if you will. It's not necessarily an apex, but it's an apex of this region. And you saw in that flattening out that that is a major characteristic that they have. How do we achieve that? Let's go ahead and kind of prune this piece to set the tone. It's going to help us educate ourselves on the rest of the tree. Okay? So now I've got these vertical pieces. If any of them are usable to continue to enhance this lower portion of it, that's awesome. But we've got the length here. We have the length here. I'm going to hold back here. I'm going to save here. Just talking about some of those nuanced approaches, and I'm looking at pairs of threes here where we saw cedrus definitely bar branching as a natural growth habit. That means that if that becomes an issue or if they're in vigorous production of growth, we're going to see more of those bar branches. We want to come in and utilize that improvement of the structure as a very major way that we handle decision making initially so that the decisions that we're making are not impairing or impeding the improvement of the structure. We need to focus on structure and aesthetics at the same time in the creation of the design that we're conceptualizing. Okay, so this is growing out over this front piece here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shorten this. Even though we want that length, I've got that length right here. I'm going to take that vertical height off of this piece right here. Continue to try and draw this out. How do I draw this out? How do I slender this down? How do I make this apical region just a little bit more flat and cedrus-esque, if you will? Saving the length here for sure. Okay, and then I think I see a branch that I'm going to have to apply wire to further improve the quality of that so that we start to execute that aesthetic. And you can see what's happening here. It's kind of magically transforming, which is exactly what we were hoping for.
Ready for a couple questions?
Ready. Rock and roll.
So Marcia said that she maybe heard this wrong. She needs to go look at spurs on her cedar. But did you say there are no buds on a spur to reduce its length?
Definitely not. I said most people think that the spurs don't have the ability to elongate, but in fact they do. and are a big part of the process of reduction, pulling on those spurs to generate the ability to grow. And I said the fact that the spurs establish themselves as non-elongating pieces of growth is of interest because the tree clearly has mechanisms to protect itself, and this being an alpine tree, I would assume it invests its resources in oxen-filled apical dominant pieces initially, but if those are compromised, and this is just a hypothetical, right? If they were compromised by a late frost in the alpine region that we would see larch and potentially cedrus be compromised by, those spurs probably become the point that the tree leans on to regenerate its next piece of elongating growth. I definitely think they're extremely important, and they absolutely can give us elongated growth. So maybe I miscommunicated, or maybe Marcia heard something other than what I said.
David said that based on the reference photos, those trees seem to be narrower than this tree. Would that mean growing the tree taller and pruning back more on the sides? The trees in the photos seem to be lighter without dense pads.
So definitely we're trying to thin out and add the negative space, which is kind of what you're seeing. So now if you compare what is happening over here to what's happening here, you're starting to see more of that space. I think we can prune in a bit more of that space. I think that the one that I really latched onto, that I drew particular attention to, is a little bit more of a short, squat, powerful, wide Cedrus, because we are going to get more vertically growing younger trees. We're going to see that height reduced with the impact of elements. Yeah, Josh, can you show them that one? Okay, and this feels a little bit more like, now we even talked about the vertical apex on the left side of that canopy almost has the same feeling as the deadwood that exists on this tree. So showing an iteration in terms of connection of characteristics. Now, I'm not trying to make this tree that tree because they're obviously different, but there are themes that we can pull on between the two trees. And that's really when we start to look at some of these nuanced imagery and things that we're drawing and deriving inspiration from, that's really how we can expertly utilize that, is not to try and duplicate it, but to try and use those thematics. I definitely see the vertical slender thematic in the younger trees. When you see the picture of the people in the snow next to the Cedrus, that also creates a significant degree of scale. And seeing that scale helps us understand the magnitude of the size of those trees. Yes, you can see the people in the snow there. Really, really small. Pretty, I would say, humble in comparison to such a massive ancient tree. And knowing the scale and the size helps us with our design because it allows us to guide our proportions. And proportion in bonsai design is not spoken about enough in terms of the appearance of a much larger tree. So when we start to talk about that slender nature or that upright nature, how do we execute that? Narrowing the width, which is really what started the process of pulling this piece up. This piece being wide, pulling it up, it reduced this left side significantly and gives greater length to the right side. And now as we continue to execute, I think you're going to see the right side grow in its length.
Daniel asks, so it's best to wait until the growth has hardened on elongating species to do structural pruning? Also, would you use the same time for, would you also prune after hardening if you were trying to encourage backbudding or building raw material?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you want to accomplish, but if you're talking about trying to transition from the tip of a branch to the interior and you've got the buds already set up, I think you can do that, I know, you can do that through the pinching process, where we pinch that tip and it stimulates the bud growth on the interior. But if we want that more elongated form, we can allow that to elongate out. We can prune it to the desired length. That will then transition in that next flush of growth with that energy pulled out of it. It will transition that growth to those buds that exist along that elongated piece, and they will grow with less vigor, less length, less density, which we're not trying to seek this dense round pad like we typically do in bonsai if we're tapping into Cedrus. If we were, we can pinch and we can pinch and we can pinch and it will get denser and denser and denser. We can elongate, draw that energy out, prune to the desired length. The next flush will be a little bit weaker, and that's what we want to keep a little bit more of that triangular slim profile growth habit in the tree. Okay, and this isn't broadly across elongating species because we did say, hey, listen, Cedrus has the ability to not just only grow once, but it can push again and again over the course of the growing season. So we can apply sort of the pinching process, combine it with maybe pruning, and start to get those different stimuli for different styles of growth.
Let's see here. Farley wants to know, how old is this tree? I don't know if we talked about that.
I'm guessing this tree is probably 50 or 60 years old. I don't have an exact age on this tree for sure, but it's an old Cedrus. It's very, very old. As far as bonsai is concerned, outside of a collected tree, probably one of the older Cedrus I've seen in bonsai cultivation. There have been a few that I've worked on over the course of the years down in the Bay Area and the California region that have been nursery stock turned to bonsai that are quite phenomenal and very, very old, but this is definitely one of them.
Let's see, we got a couple design ideas. Rafi thinks you should consider removing the lower branch on the right. He also says, consider creating a massive gin of the entire branch, similar to the one going off the top.
This whole branch, he wants me to eliminate that whole branch?
Or turn it into a gin, yes.
So here's what I think about this, because I definitely respect the notion that there's inverse taper, right? I think we have to decide at what stage of the game are we tapping into the age of the tree, right? And I don't know that we have all of the characteristics worked out through the canopy to be able to tease out ancient at this point in time. Ancient, we would see a significant reduction of what was, the remnants of it, massive amounts of negative space. And I think that our asymmetry in terms of this design, the width that we're looking for will compress the apex to get the width in that apex. I think we need that length laterally if we choose to compress. Now, if we were going to say, hey, listen, let's go to a more upright, slender form of Cedrus, then absolutely, either the right branch or the left branch would have to go to start to create this feeling where we would knock off half of that width. It would definitely elevate the tree, and we would start to create smaller and smaller pads with that scattered nature. I feel like this taps more into the blue Atlas cedar that we did from Pacific Bonsai Museum in terms of that verticality that we had in the height of that tree. This is a relatively short, stubby tree, and this dead piece here represents a prominent apex that was lost as we connect it to that older image that we saw of the broader cedar image, and we start to see the loss of that, creating that lateral width and other branches growing up and taking on that candelabra-ish form, right? I also think we have to be careful. If you remove the right or the left branch, you're going to open up a massive amount of negative space around an inverse piece of swelling in the central portion of the trunk, that although it's been proposed that we carve that a little bit more, I don't know that a reduction of the wood or an addition of shari would solve that problem, because you still have the width that dominates, and if you magnify the negative space around that width, it's going to be even more prominent in terms of the way we interpret it. As long as this branch stays in a region where when we look from the front, it starts to flirt with the inverse taper on this side, and you guys can see this, right? As long as it's sitting there kind of playing in it, there's just this green mass right here, okay? As long as that's playing in it, all of a sudden, we see this crotch and that natural form of the structure as it pertains to Cedrus, and I think you're not so distracted by the inverse taper because it is there, by that negative space that exists in that crotch, and I think that's where we really have achieved a little bit by opening up this line, focusing that crotch, showing this piece as a part of that story, and now continuing to try and evolve that and grow that design concept a little bit further.
Paul wants to know if we could get a little more info on the care for these trees, watering, fertilizing, sun, winter care.
Totally. So Cedrus, and let's just kind of, and we're going to come back and we're going to style some raw Cedrus from nursery stock that have been grown, show you guys that process, because Cedrus is unique in a lot of different ways. Typically, they do prefer to be repotted a little bit later than our other species, just as we see the buds starting to swell or even starting to open. They are definite necessitators of heat to get that new root regeneration started and really carried forward. So we're repotting them at the tail end of our repotting season as we see them start to grow. And that's a big major factor for success with the root work of Cedrus. Now, when we start to talk about the nuances of watering, they love water as long as the foliar mass is elongating and being produced. We've got to be very careful with watering if they're not growing vigorously, because they depend on a balance of water and oxygen, much like any of our other conifers. But being an elongating species, being an alpine species where heavy snow falls, they definitely utilize a lot of water in the bonsai container. This tree is a very thirsty tree. Even in this gigantic pot, we have to be very on top of watering with Cedrus in order to cultivate them well. And then when we start to talk about management of growth, we know they're going to give us that big flush. Now, if we want to increase density, or we want to stimulate back buds to grow to add to the density of that branch, we can pinch. Pinching that elongating shoot as it's still soft and very, very supple, pinching that off removes that auxin, stimulates the growth of all of those buds that are mounted on this tree right now for next spring's push. The tips are naturally going to elongate. I pinch that and the buds on the interior start to grow. But if we pinch this, we haven't removed any of the energy, and these buds will all start to elongate with a significant amount of strength. That's okay because we can pinch those, but it makes it very dense and ball-like in its form. If we allow that first piece to elongate, and then we come back in and prune back to the buds that we want, that will stimulate those buds to grow, but they will have less energy to grow because that tip has run out a lot of that energy, and this is how we can keep them a little bit thinner and more delicate in their profile. So you really have the ability to choose. Do I pinch to refine the branch and add density, or do I allow it to elongate, run that energy out, prune, knowing I'm going to get a second flush that's more refinable, and then start to manage that via pinching or potentially even going back and just pruning that? You could prune a Cedrus 2 or 3 times over the course of the growing season and be able to create very beautiful refined growth by managing the energy, fertilizing the tree with a little bit lighter amount of fertilizer so we don't create that big amount of vigor in addition to the stored resources it's developing right now in the fall. There are multiple ways to handle this. I am a big fan, if the aesthetic is for this very slender growth habit, to let it elongate and prune as opposed to pinching. But pinching will create density, sometimes to the degree that it becomes a dense ball and we need to go in and thin it out.
Ted is wondering what your thoughts are on the collar of that big piece of dead wood. Is that on the verge of being too dramatic a transition, or is there enough of a downward tear or tear to be all good?
In terms of the dead, oh, right in here?
Yeah, the collar of it.
So we can't stop, and this is one of the great limitations of the vigorous growth of elongating species. We know that these species, whether it's a spruce, whether it's a hemlock, whether it's a cedar, whether it's a fir, fall is their wheelhouse. They are frost-tolerant, cold-tolerant, durable trees that have to accumulate a massive amount of resources in order to be able to endure the winter conditions that they're genetically adapted and that the regions that they've occupied through their ability to outcompete other species in those conditions. As a result, we know that it's naturally going to thicken over the course of time. Now, if you guys are asking me, what would you have done early on in this tree's life to prevent this from happening, I definitely would have, knowing what I know now, started this branch with a greater upward movement closer to the trunk. I probably would have carried this down a little bit farther to make a little bit less consistency in the formation of that callus roll. But where we're at now, you have to ask yourself, does carving this open, experiencing the massive amount of sap spill out that you're going to get from that action, and having the artificiality of those multiple layers now on that tree, is it going to be aesthetically a benefit to the design? I think we're at a point with this tree where it doesn't necessarily benefit it. I do believe over the course of time, one of these two sides is going to have to go. I do believe that. I subscribe to that. I think everybody offering that is in the right range of thinking about the tree, and all of a sudden the aesthetic is going to change. Where it's at now, I don't think we have the clarity to know which one we need to remove and what direction we need to go, and I'm going to let the tree give us a little more. As we refine the root system, use the foliar mass to drive the development and refinement of the rest of the tree, kind of tell us, and we will find that over the course of time.
Leonard asks, when you're discussing refinement, when a branch has a multitude of buds, do you start plucking them off to create design characteristics?
When a branch has a multitude of buds, then what I will do is I will stop utilizing a technique that stimulates their growth. Because buds are only potential until they're activated. And this is where, although I think pinching is a great technique to move energy from strong to medium, medium to weak, to build up density, which is an important thing that we know and utilize in the elongating species genre of growth, I don't feel like for Cedrus it's the best technique that you can utilize to be managing the growth on them, because I think the product that you get is a growth habit not desirable for the execution of a more natural Cedrus form. Now, if you're making a Cedrus bonsai, then absolutely get it dense, build those branches, show that bonsai form. I've got no issue with that. But that's where it comes down to this dividing line of, are you making a natural cedrus or are you making a bonsai? And tonight's design discussion is about how do we take this tree further down that mark with the inspirations that we drew from those images and the characteristics that this material has to make it a natural representation of cedrus. And I think this tree has all of the markers and makings to execute a natural cedrus incredibly well. So that's where we're starting to talk about the management of the growth being allowing it to elongate, keeping it nice and thin, and then coming back and pruning to be able to manage that. And the freedom inside of it, right? We try to latch on to, okay, I hear that you're giving me options. I don't want options. I just want you to tell me how. I don't want to tell you guys how. I want to tell you the multiple ways that you can manage this and then let you decide so that we all have a different interpretation of cedrus with the tools to be able to manage the growth. So what we're seeing now is a pruning of these elongated pieces that are a remnant of that first pruning. Either they grew as a result of that first pruning, or these were the unpruned weaker pieces that were stimulated by that pruning, and that pruning again happened in May. So we're getting that second flush to occur, or the weaker branches to transition that energy to occur. Now we're using that length to create that triangular form and a little bit more space in the design. Okay, now I've got a really, what I would think to be a valuable branch back in the back here. I'm going to rotate it and let you guys tell me what you think here. Okay, I've got this branch. I've pruned it to a triangular form. I've got, let me just get a few more of these downward growing pieces in here because they're really, they're so freaking vigorous once you get them built up. Okay, now this is existing here, and in the bonsai sense, we want this branch. Fills in space. It's a back branch to give us depth. Right? We want that, right, on this major structural piece. But do we want that? When we start to think about this piece disappearing and opening the door to tap into this branch in the back that some people have already commented, those branches in the back have so much depth. Look at the space. Okay, when you start to see this and you see where that movement is taking place, look at how that's occupying that space. This would lighten exponentially the feel of this branch, okay? It would lighten it, it would reduce it, and it would stop or slow down the thickening because we would be taking away photosynthetic mass. Now let me rotate it towards you, okay? You see what's going to happen. We take this out. Now all we have is this. We do, though, have the ability to utilize some of these pieces as bigger drop pieces that fill that space in, but pull that length in and take advantage of that space. If we want to push the tree to the right, I think we want to lighten and reduce the amount of foliar mass that we have here. I'm curious what you guys think. I'm going to start working on this. Let me know. Does this go or does it stay?
Got some more design thoughts. Rafi is kind of talking more about his idea of ginning the entire lower right branch. It would shift movement to the left, engage with that top gin, but he's saying this is for the future to be considered
for the
in
future.
10 years. Yeah.
And I don't even know if it's 10 years.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more like 2 or 3 years.
And then David says take out the lower left in the future, consistent with the side of the existing gin, develops a harmonious design.
Be. Yes, I see that potential. Tying the gin into this piece could be amazing. Could be amazing, right? But again, you're going to have full visibility of that inverse taper. How does this gin and this deadwood tie into the trunk? Do we lose all the bark on one side? Does it damage the rootstock that exists here? We have to be a little careful. They're not vein specific. We would want to take that subtle reduction, and maybe this branch is the first move in that direction. I see that. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're fine. You didn't. But so then what you just asked about, we've got mostly go. We got Mike saying stay, Marcia, Sarah, David, Rich, Ted, all think it should go.
Think it should go?
Yeah, Ted says, now that you pointed out, it looks crowded. Kirk and John both say remove it.
Here we go. If it was a mostly stay, I would have reconsidered it. I can see reasons for both.
Yeah.
I want more space in this design to tap into what I was seeing in terms of that older form. We know that we have the ability to heavily reduce. Let's just start with a very, I would call this a juvenile move and commitment towards that.
Whoa. Whoa.
Okay. It's
Wow.
breathing now, right?
It has so much more dimension
Yeah, it's
already.
breathing now. Yep. I love this. And also, this just continues to feel shorter and shorter now. Now we're starting, look at that planular nature. For you guys, we've changed the studio around. Josh is now up in the mothership producing the stream, so I have full view of what you guys are seeing for the first time in the past 3 years of Mirai Live, and it helps me see the tree a lot better. I love the nuance that we've brought about here. I think now we've got to talk about how do we utilize these to open up this space. And I'm not even sure, now when we look here, I'm not even sure that we want to occupy that, because watch this, okay? When I'm here, if I drop that out of that position, now we get that kind of a vibe, okay? Now we've got some density that's occurring up in these regions that we can continue to thin, but I actually think this piece getting out of there gives us more space in the composition. And I'm kind of wondering if we don't need to just go ahead and shed that, be free of this piece altogether. I'm going to make an executive decision to go ahead and get rid of this piece as well.
Ooh.
Wow. Didn't anticipate this. Okay. So now that does start to open up more space. Now let's see if we can continue to lighten in through here. I've got a lot of branches in this midsection. I want to give more priority, space between those pads. I want to find that lightness. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take one out in here that's kind of starting to form a structural flaw. It was kept originally because this tree was actually very, very, very pot bound and in extremely rough shape the first time, okay? Now we get that, look at that negative space on the left side now. I love this, I love this, I love this.
We got a couple comments and questions.
Okay.
Kim says so this was about 5 minutes ago, she was seeing deep wire bite above your hand. Seems like those aren't going to grow out well. Can you address it?
So there, I'm going to say there isn't deep wire bite in this, but we also have the bark moving so far out onto it that I'm not worried about the Cedrus, number one, in its production of vascular tissue, consuming that and healing that. This tree has had multiple wire bites over the course of time, but it will be something I need to look at because we know fall is when they start accumulating all of their vascular resources, so it's not going to get better. As I started preparing for the stream tonight, I saw that the wire was starting to bite in. It will definitely be something that we're addressing. If you notice, I'm not adding a lot of new wire. I did a little minimal piece up here. There's no wire bite in that section, but I do see some of the thicker pieces that I need to take off before they cause any more damage. So definitely the secondary piece that you guys won't experience about this is I'll do all the shaping with the current wire on it. I'll take off the biting pieces, replace them if I need to, but utilizing the wire now and being able to design with the shape already held in the tree is really, really convenient for us as bonsai practitioners because we don't have to wire and then figure it out. It's wired, we figure it out, we can correct what's left afterwards.
Leonard asks, what about the vertical branch now sticking out like a sore thumb? I don't know what branch he's referring to. But it might be something we haven't worked on yet.
I don't know. We're definitely going to get to all the places that they hate. No doubt about it.
Charles suggests that it could use some negative space in the right mid-lower branch.
Yeah, the right side. We're getting there. Let's keep working. So one thing that you guys probably are now aware of in my bonsai approach is I have a notion that we've got to reduce, that we've got to flatten the apex, that we need more space and more triangular planular growth. This is the theme that I approach a redesign with, okay? And so when I'm coming into this, you have to grow into that process. You have to grow into knowing what that looks like. And it started just with a little bit of work here, and it's starting to snowball. You're seeing the momentum grow. Branches I didn't think were going to come out are coming out. Negative space is coming to fruition. We see the aesthetic working, and we like what we're seeing in terms of what's happening here. This is how we build on that momentum. Create that momentum for yourselves in design, because it really helps coming in and just making this like boom, big decision, how one of those branches goes. Maybe by the end of it we get there, but we're not there yet. Let yourself build to that. This is a process and it's freaking enjoyable. It's incredibly enjoyable to start working with the tree. I have the feel of the tree now. I see the momentum. I see where we can do different things to maximize the quality of the aesthetic. And now we start to roll. Now we start to make those decisions. Really, I think people have an impression that with bonsai, a bonsai professional approaches a tree and they just know what they're going to do. Most of the time, I honestly really don't know until I've started to do what I'm gonna do. What I start with are very fundamental ideas, big concepts that I'm trying to execute, and then I start to allow that momentum to accumulate as I get into the tree, experience the tree, and make decisions that I see coming to fruition. And if I made a decision and it was wrong, then I can still rebound from it not having made a big dramatic decision. Right? So just pruning some of these smaller shoots and talking with you guys about Cedrus, I'm honestly just educating myself as we begin this process to figure out what is this scope of work going to look like this time. And now we start to see that we're cracking the code of the tree right now.
Leonard specified, he was talking about a vertical branch on the left side, kind of right in front of you. I think.
Left side right in front. Oh, this guy right here?
I think so.
Oh man, we made that vertical. That's cedar. That's Cedrus, baby.
Jacob asks, when you consider removing the big left bottom branch, do you consider that big actions like that might take years off a tree you might want to pass on to the next generation of bonsai?
No, I don't think it takes years off of the tree. And in fact, when we're cultivating bonsai, really what we're doing is we're making decisions to elevate the design at this time. But the beautiful thing about it is that it's going to grow again on top of that design, and it's going to evolve, and the tree's going to move back towards a more juvenile form of that iteration of design no matter what you do. And this is really where, if you guys listen to the discussion with David Siegel from Australia, where we're driving to Canberra for the event that Lime and I were working at while we were there, you know, the discussion of ownership of design and other professionals changing design and the letting go of that concept is the fact that, hey, a tree has to have these different inputs and iterations. And in those different inputs and iterations, all of a sudden, it accumulates that history. It will always continue to fill out and be young again if it's cultivated correctly. And if we want to carry it further, we can. If we want to bring it back more towards the bonsai form or symmetry, we can. It's a constantly reinventing form of art. Okay, I love the aesthetic that we got out of this left side. This feels Cedrus to me. I don't know if you guys are feeling it. I'm feeling it though. Sitting here, I'm feeling it. It's like, oh, there it is. Now we've tapped into it. Now we've found it. Now we've started to identify it. I think I'm ready, having found what we're looking for and started to really hone in on the reduction of these pieces. I think I'm ready to start talking about how do we handle these other locations in the tree, because one of the things that we start to see is this piece almost has a necessary upward, almost needs to move upward as well. Okay, so when I come in and I move that up, that starts to feel more Cedrus than it down, right? One more time, up. See that up and out movement, and we have that long piece right there. That feels very Cedrus to me. Let's go there with the next move and see how that starts to work with the rest of the shape.
Kim says she feels that the right and the apex need thinning out in order to create uniformity and balance.
We're gonna get there.
I figured as much.
We are rocking and rolling now.
Rafi asks says the deadwood on that top gin seems very well aged. Is it naturally that old, or was it carved?
So this is a product of Will Baddeley.
Nice.
Will Baddeley, who was at Mirai and who worked on the big Taxus that we repotted, and then everybody gave him a hard time because then I used the back side after he'd spent so much time on the front side. That Taxus, of which is styled now. It's been on the live stream twice, initially for the structural setting, second for the repotting. Looks absolutely brilliant. I'm so pumped about it. And I'm really happy with the work Will has done. I sent him an email. I said, Will, come back and finish this thing. We can make the back look just as beautiful. We'll see what he says, but I hope he does come back and finish the work on that, because I think he started something very, very powerful in the deadwood work that he was doing. So he did this work. One of the discussions that I had with Bob Hilvers, the curator of the Clark collection, was Will doing the deadwood on this after it had initially been styled. And I think he did a great job. It's tough to manipulate the deadwood of a tree that you don't necessarily know. If you haven't seen it in its natural context, you don't necessarily know how do these grow, what does the deadwood look like, how do they decay. And I think Will took a very respectful route in the creation of the deadwood on this piece. His skills with deadwood manipulation are incredible.
Sarah said that in the past she has heard you mention that you work on the defining branch first because it sets the tone for the rest of the design.
Yes.
Is the section you're working on now the defining branch, or was there another reason you began on that side first?
I began on this side because I knew that I needed to raise this line and push it in. So I knew the reduction was going to happen here. And typically we try to define that to know the length of this side. But since this tree has already been styled and had one iteration of design that it's filled in on, I started here with that being the original narrowing of it to get a little bit more of this, although this is inspired by a broader Cedrus form. Narrowing here, elevating this line from lateral to vertical, tapping into, again, that Cedrus growth habit. And that's starting to give me the ideas that I can carry over to that side of the tree. So typically, and again, when we're designing for the first time, that defining branch, absolutely paramount. But coming back to it, this was the only place that I felt comfortable really starting to implement my concepts of design on this tree and seeing how they all pan out. And the other thing that I'll tell you is this tree has been secondary worked out in terms of the secondary branches have been wired. It does not have a lot of tertiary ramification and refinement in it quite yet, because when we redid it, it hadn't been worked in so long, and I know that it's been worked because this was clearly a man-made choice, the deadwood originally, but I don't know the last time that it had been worked, and you couldn't see any signs that it had been manipulated in recent history. So it was almost like styling it again for the first time, starting that secondary process over. It still feels maybe a little bit thick up here. I think with a little bit of wire we can bring those down. I feel pretty comfortable with where that's at. But I think that's a super keen question. I'm glad that somebody brought that up. Why did you not start with the defining branch? And for me, again, it's the process of having identified the desire to narrow, and the side that I was going to be doing that work on allowed me to tease out some of those nuances. Now, when I get into these midsections, I want to keep this elongated, pointed feel to these pieces of growth. So I don't necessarily need this getting denser towards the interior, but I need these edges to preserve that nuance and that quality and that character. Okay? So I don't want to shorten these and create this compact, rounded form. I want to be pulling this into that triangular form that we've been talking about. And I sound like a broken record about it, but to be reminded of what we're trying to accomplish is a big part of how we keep ourselves on point when we're making big reductive decisions in the design of a tree. Sometimes I too can lose sight as I'm performing this kind of work. And it's nice to be consistently stating our intention in the design to keep ourselves really, really going the way that we need to. Okay, looks lovely.
It does.
That looks lovely. Looks very, very light. Looks very, very narrow space, daylight everywhere. Love it. You guys ready to tackle that defining branch? Let's see what we can do with this defining branch. Now I'm going to come over here while we're all watching. Okay, and let's just see. In my mind, this is a little bit muddled here. And if I look at these two pieces, I do find more value in this piece. And let me show Jesus this, just so you guys can see what I'm talking about, okay? When I look at these two, they're sort of running parallel to each other, which I don't have an issue with. They're the same length, which I do have an issue with. Same density in general on the branch. And if I had to value one over the other, I love the smaller pieces that are working vertically off of this upper piece. I feel like if we want to increase transparency to this defining branch and open up some of that space, that this lower piece is going to have to go. And it's going to really isolate the triangular nature of this smaller piece that we've brought down and differentiated. Let's see what this will do to the design as we start to reduce it. It's a big, thick wire on that thing. Resetting the structure on this was like, it was like a marathon activity. The guys at the Clark collection and all of the people that help with that collection were super pivotal in some of those initial decisions. And now I hope they're watching because I appreciate their efforts. Tree looks great, healthy. Those guys seriously kick butt. I love Love the Clark collection and all of the people that are a part of that. And if you live in the Central Valley or you live in California or you're visiting, you need to go see it because there's some really interesting pieces, time capsules of history in the form of bonsai that are very unique to Central California and that collection.
Rafi thinks you should remove the lower branch hanging down.
This guy?
I think so.
Okay. I feel that felt clean. That felt like a good, clean execution of aesthetic. Now, let's come back to the wide. Okay, I like this lightening and clarification. We're pulling that theme through this tree now. And again, bear in mind, this is a little course up here where I've cut back to, but we're gonna build, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. This is the elongating species theme. We build, we come back in and we structurally clarify. We build, we come back in and we structurally clarify. So it gets really dense and finished looking, and then you have to go in and you have to cut a lot of that out and clarify that structure and improve it and prevent structural flaws, advance the design. This is right on pace with where we would want this to be, okay? One of the areas that I'm looking at now is some of this beautiful branching structure. Remember when we were looking up into that tree and we saw all of that beautiful branching structure? We're not getting it right here because we've used a very common bonsai concept. And again, I'm the one who styled this. I kept all of the interior growth and I covered those interior lines. But I don't think that now is a good execution of an older Cedrus form. Let's go ahead and open that up and see what that does to start to guide the process of really perfecting this defining branch. Okay, so there's that. Let's go ahead and see if we can't change, since we've changed the angle. Some of these branches have gotten a little bit more audacious in their position and form. Might wire these two guys down. Let me go ahead and do that real quick. Let's make sure that we've got all structural flaws taken care of. Okay, I hear Rafi's pleas for reduce the dropping branch, reduce the dropping branch. Let's see what happens when we lighten this section, because it may change our opinion of how functional that piece is. And the other aspect of it is when you reduce a branch that's occupying the negative space between the rim of the container and the first piece of structure, you open up a massive window of negative space. Just by dropping this here, I think that did phenomenal for the design. It's not well worked in that space, and that's what we need to improve upon. But let me continue to pull back in this greater area of density, and let's see what happens just as we start to open this up, now having set that style and the tone of the work on the other side.
Ready for a couple more questions?
Ready, let's rock.
Okay, so Matt asks, how well does cedar and all elongating species backbud on a leggy older branch? Will you get backbuds and be able to get growth closer to the trunk?
So they will backbud, not as we would, and it depends on what our frame of reference is, because if it's a deciduous tree where you can stump cut it back and it just profusely throws out buds, definitely not an option with Cedrus. Not an option with Cedrus whatsoever. But as we get it more and more healthy, you can see where a lot of the branches are at the base of these bigger pieces. They bud back anywhere where there's no bark, okay, where the bark hasn't formed. And let me have Jesus just kind of zoom in. This window that I've created, the bark is forming here. It's moved up to here, but this is smooth. Let me know when you're there. Okay, we there, Josh? Yeah. Okay, so we've got the bark forming, and you can see the plates forming here. You can actually see this transitional area right here where there's like the graying, it's not as light. And you can also see a big fat wire scar there. Don't worry, I'll take care of that, okay? And then you get into this smooth, almost like an elephant's foot kind of a vibe, really fleshy. So they will push back, but you can't cut a Cedrus back to virtually nothing and all of a sudden have it respond. You've got to build to that. This kind of a cutback on a tree that has this kind of strength, and you can see the vascular resources that are being stored in it, this kind of tree will definitely respond with a significant push of growth on the interior as a result of this kind of cutback. But look at what we built it to before we performed it. A lot of times people will allow Cedrus to grow in a big heavy cutback, and you get all of that big pushback, but you have to prep it to be able to. On a tree that's in development, we build that girth and we cut it back, leaving some foliage mass because it is a conifer. It will give us buds on the interior as a result of that action that we take. Okay, now this lower branch that is definitely in question, I'm going to leave this long. I'm going to leave this really, really aerodynamic in its form, super triangular, but I'm going to pick it up so that it doesn't look as if it's kind of slouching, because the nature of Cedrus is not to be slouching. It's not this kind of arcing or drooping form. We want this nice, clean, kind of triangular form. Even though in nature, if you looked at them on an individual branch level, you would definitely have those branches appearing like they're drooping. When you look at it in the macro scale, when you back up, they look so sharp and just beautiful. And that's kind of what we're striving for, okay? And this piece all the way on the interior, if I'm going to save, and we've already stated we are going to save this lower branch because it closes down the negative space here. If I'm going to save this piece of it, I have to save this piece of it. And let me show you guys that, okay? If I'm going to save this piece, I have to save this piece. And I'm saving it for a very, very specific reason, okay? Because when we talk about valuable structure over the long run for a branch, you never want to be leaving this big, long structural branch with all the ramification at the tip. That's not a good structure. So this piece being back here where we have a very short internode and a junction, another internode and a junction, increases the quality of this branch as it pertains to this particular tree during this iteration, which means if we're going to get rid of this, we might as well cut the whole thing, and we said we're not ready for that. So this is for quality of structure, decisions to be able to utilize this branch. Maybe the next time we come back, this branch goes, but we know right now it definitively is going to stay in the design.
David says that if the lower, this is like a design idea, if the lower left branch is to be removed, he would think it would need to be partially ginned so it can be done like reflecting a newly dead branch rather than having to blend it with the older one.
Oh, I see.
Kim wants to know if you're puttying those big cuts after you make them.
So there hasn't been a cut that's big enough yet on a Cedrus for me to really concern myself with puttying. If I removed one of the really big pieces, I would definitely have to worry with sap bleeding, etc. But we're not encroaching on that territory quite yet in this work and scope of work that we're performing. So no, and not currently. And I was going to apply just a little bit of wire to that.
And then Andrew wants to know if you know of anybody on the West Coast that's field growing cedar.
I do, actually. I do. I'm not ready to tell you guys yet because that means that you would get to them before me.
Fair.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. That would be so bold of me to actually proclaim that. So I don't know about Lebanese cedar, but I do know that John Muth at Bonsai Northwest in Seattle is growing some of what I would consider to be the best field-grown Cedrus in the country. Bonsai Northwest, John's been field growing out on Vashon outside of Seattle, which is an island, for quite a long time. And I just saw somebody had visited his operation, and there were some tremendous raw Cedrus. Blue Atlas, I do believe he has green as well. There were some tremendous cedars that he had grown available at Bonsai Northwest. And I would encourage you guys to reach out to John because it is hard to find good cedar stock. Obviously, the reference for Cedrus would be Jim Grimmel and Deer Meadow Bonsai in Northern California. I don't know if Jim is still actively producing more Cedrus or not, but I do know that John Muth is doing a hell of a job. Those two people would be the two individuals that I would reference and turn people to if they were looking for good, really well-grown Cedrus stock. But I saw them at the BSOP Rendezvous last year when we came back from the national show. John had some of his field-grown Cedrus there, and they were really, really good. Seeing the images of the ones that he has up there now, it's like they're even better. And I'm assuming now that he's got the rhythm and the equation figured out to being able to cultivate Cedrus on the level that he clearly has figured out, they're only going to get better and better and better with that time. Okay, always pruning to a bud, trying to avoid the needles. I'm also trying to work relatively quickly because it took me a while to find the nuances of this tree, but now we have it, okay? All right. Oof.
Ooh.
Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop this down just a little bit there so that we slender that down. Now I'm curious if we feel like that bottom branch should exist. Let me just see if I can clean up that aesthetic just a little bit. It's right here in the tip that is kind of giving us that real lazy, and maybe this piece, yeah, it's this piece right here. Okay, let me drop that down so that it doesn't feel so, there we go. A little bit more, perfect. Okay, well, how bad do I want to cut that off right now? Pretty bad, pretty darn bad. We'll leave it like that. We'll call it good. Let's come up to here. Okay, because this actually, interestingly enough, forms the greatest amount of definition in terms of our asymmetry. This piece giving us that greatest amount of length, greatest amount of flow to the right of the tree. I want to try and elongate this as much as I can, pull that baby out, and we see how thick and how built up this piece is in here. I'm going to start to reduce. I'm going to start to thin this out just a little bit. And let me make the right decisions. I've got a little bit of a structural flaw a brewing in here. So let's see what that looks like. This piece has got to come out. Come on, baby.
Matt wants to know, what are the best times to work on cedar, like first and second best times?
Yeah, great question, Matt. So if we're in the developmental period and we're going to be doing big, heavy branch reduction, etc., we can do so while they have all of their stored sugars and starches in the spring before they push out. We can make big cuts as long as we've built them to that. Or if we haven't quite built them up, or we want to see how they're going to flush out in terms of energy to make big decisions, after that first flush hardens is another really good time. Now, if we're seeking refinement, if we're trying to get finer and finer growth, if we're evolving design and we don't want that big, coarse, flush push out of growth, right now, before they accumulate their resources over the course of fall, we want to be reducing that foliar mass so that they don't store up energy with that big, abundant foliar mass, and then we cut it all off in the springtime. We prune them now, they accumulate resources on the foliar mass that we have left over, and next year's spring growth is going to be far more controllable as a result of the fact that we're doing this work now, and we're reducing the amount of density and foliar mass that's going to accumulate sugars and starches. So this is a really opportune time, but this timing right now is more geared towards trying to refine a cedrus than it is trying to develop a cedrus. That development, if you want thickening, leaving as much needle mass on the tree over the fall as possible is going to give you that maximum impact of all of that photosynthetic productivity.
I got a couple comments. Folks still feeling conflicted about that lower right branch.
This one?
Yeah. Ted thinks you should keep it.
Let me step back where you guys are.
Leonard thinks that the branch you were just working on could replace it.
Well, but okay, so if I cut this off and then I drop this one down, what have we really done? You know, we've just, you know, like if you're going to cut a structural branch off, you have to be thinking about the space that you open up with it as the real. And I think a lot of people tend to cut off structural branches because they don't like the branch. Can't do that. That's a very juvenile form of design, to cut it off saying, I don't like it, so I'm going to cut it off. Oof, well, you totally destroy a tree doing that. I think we're good with this. Let me just see what we got here.
Yeah, it's pretty split. We're about half and half on that.
I think the negative space that exists below that is going to be so overwhelming. I see. Here's what it does do, and let's talk about the positives of it and what it does do. It definitely reduces that similarity of the height of the branches being on the same plane across the bottom. Because you have this here, you can't take this out, otherwise this branch starts to become a little bit more unsightly. By removing this, your next foliar plane is up here, and that shift from here to here is pretty major. Whereas if we show this, we do have a shift from here to here, but it feels less significant. Here's the other thing. This branch comes up structurally. Having this drop down does feel a bit awkward, and I do sympathize with you guys in that. And I also think when we start to look at this, everybody might be tapping into the fact that the really wide, the real big width of the shape is not working as well. If you cut that lower branch off, I think you have to shift the length to the left side of the tree and really start pushing out with that big branch on the left. And maybe that's the more dominant branch in the design anyways. So basically, if we take this off, now we start pushing the tree this way, with this being more defining. And it is the thicker branch that does have the greater amount of structural impact. If you're going to cut that branch off, though, I think it's risky to take this off. But we can go that way. I'm not against it. There is definitely a new train of thought that's been opened up. Troy, you have any thoughts on that? I like that upward movement that you see without it there, though, right? Yeah. And then I think if you do that, I think we could drop this down a little bit. Let's drop this down and just see what happens.
It's very split still in chat.
Chat is split, huh?
Chat is vocal but split. A lot of people say just wait for it to thicken and see what happens. Sarah thinks you should just shorten it and see what that looks like. And Josh upstairs says this isn't the final form of the tree. That branch will get thicker with more foliage.
It'll get thicker.
Yes.
Josh is killing it at Bonsai.
Yeah, he is. I mean, and yeah, it's about half and half. A lot of people want to keep it. A lot of people think it should go.
Interesting. Really interesting. I did not see that branch being such a heavily debated piece, but I do appreciate and understand the passion around that branch.
People are commenting, well, Rafi and Kurt think that lowering that one that you were just working on seems to work nicely.
Works nicely, but also the shape of it, if I lowered it down here, being that big arc, was not super attractive. This coming off the bottom, if we're going to occupy that, but I think seeing this through here definitely adds another very Cedrus line to the design. I find that to be really engaging and interesting in that region of the tree. And I'm wondering if this branch in the back now needs to stay or if this branch in the back needs to go. Because it is also creating some of that sort of symmetry and abundance of youth. That feels very, oh, see now I like that. I really like that.
Yeah.
It creates that out-in movement that we were talking about that we liked.
Yeah, folks are saying Tyson thinks some movement to the left would be good.
Movement to the left is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go with this one before they have a chance to chime in.
Kim likes it.
Likes it off?
Yeah.
Good. Kim, you got it. Here it comes. This is for you.
Ted says that in the photos we looked at earlier, most of those Lebanese cedars were a little more balanced, kind of like what we have now.
We're getting closer to that, aren't we? I don't know that my bias around ancient necessarily applied to what we were seeing in those photos, and that's, this is where collaboration is so incredibly beautiful. Getting to engage with you guys. I mean, look at what we're creating. This is truly a product that is outside of my definitive experience. I've worked with Cedrus a lot, but I'm very, very interested in what's happening right now with this tree. And I'm going to shorten this. If we're going to keep this, which I think we need to keep this, then I'm going to shorten this one below it so that we go out, in, out again, and just keep this really nice and tight. I don't think we want this to be super long. Okay, let's shorten here a little bit. Let's shorten here a little bit. I'm going to pull back into the interior here. There we go. Okay, that feels good. And then let's try and get this taken care of. Okay, and this has got a little bit of that rounded feeling, so I'm going to start to take out these pieces. Okay, and just keep that pointed tip as my real guiding light. Okay, so I'm going to prune these back in a triangular way, back to buds, back to buds. They get longer as I go back. Okay, pruning these off of overwhelming this piece because we've already identified, hey, this feels kind of important. How does that feel? Oh, okay. Kind of moody, kind of interesting. Feels like I lost a little bit of the pointy nature of it. Might have gone a little too far. It'll come back next year. I hate it when I do that. Working in a hurry. There's that pointy nature. There we go. And tease that back into the design as much as we can. Don't be afraid to clean up these bottom needles that are super long either. Cleaning them up and defining, right? I've been doing it periodically. I haven't done it rigorously in this design. But Cedrus, much like a pine, you get all those hanging below that canopy, and all of a sudden it starts to clog up that bottom line of the design. Not necessarily the most beautiful thing. Okay, now I'm going to rotate some of these elongated pieces. Give me that spike again, and I want some of that here too. So I'm going to pull that nice piece there. So let me come back. I'm working in a little bit of a shadow for these guys. Okay, Jesus, just kind of focusing on this piece right here to utilize as a discussion, this whole plane right here. How are we doing on time, Sam?
It is 7:40.
All right.
Wayne brought up something kind of interesting that, like, from the current front, it looks like there's 4 branches coming from the same spot on the right side. And it might just be a symptom of looking at it two-dimensionally.
Yeah, because there's no structural flaws that big, but we'll take a look at it. Okay, so as I'm working through here, I had cut this tip and I'd actually pushed it back and it felt real round right here. And so I flared this piece out and I got that nice elongated tip, and that's a perfect execution of the aesthetic, because if I take that off, you see how balled up all of that is? And then you add that little finality, and then this one here too. As I swing this out and you see that sharp piece there, go out to that singular leader, now it gives me that triangular form that I've been stressing all night. So when we have these, be very careful about how you use those aesthetically, because you can strip the tree of what makes it particularly special and interesting as a representation of the species. And if we do, we always know we can change our habits the following season or the next flush of growth to adapt. Okay, all right. Okay, so we've got a little bit, I'm just gonna chase this back to get a little, okay. All right, let's get up to this apex. Let's see if we can tackle this now, because I think we're pretty primed to roll. Now, I still haven't made up my mind about the lowest branch, and we've got a 50-50 split on the stream. Is that where we're at?
Yeah.
What do you think, Sam? You kind of called the angle change here. Keep this or do away with it?
Yeah.
Is that a lot of pressure to put on you?
No, it's not. I mean, I'm just an observer. It doesn't, my opinion, against the many, my opinion is just one. But I don't know. I kind of liked it without, but I also don't think now is the time. I think we should maybe wait and see. But I don't love it. Mm-hmm. I like the idea of moving more to the left. That was what I thought when tilting it, like the whole, like, weight. I mean, maybe not that specific branch, more like the whole tree to the left.
To the left and elongating there.
Yeah.
So if we have this kind of conundrum, I would say this kind of conundrum is a very common aspect of bonsai design. It's going to be extremely easy to elongate on the left side, put a sheet over this again, and see how we feel. And if we're not quite there yet, and we can't make up that decision, there's no harm in transitioning that decision to a point where we can actually start to implement other design goals that take that into account. And I think I agree with, I think I agree that I want to go that way because I like the prominence put on that left branch. I don't know that I totally believe it by removing this yet. I don't know that I believe it.
People liked that leftward motion
Yeah,
on it.
because one of the things that was making this feel unnatural is it was rivaling this for length. So when we bring it to the foreground, this now pops out, more space here, less prominent. We see less of the line that we find unattractive as that downward move, and we start to maybe implement it more in closing this space and having the value I've been discussing. We're just working through it. This is really quite enjoyable.
Yeah, Vern says the lower branch looks more like part of the tree now that the upper branches are worked. Marcia says, why would we elongate to the left with deadwood on the left and movement of tree to the right?
True. I mean, depending on how much we want to abide by that story, I mean, maybe that got knocked off. What we did see with the ancient representations of the cedar is it doesn't appear as though there was a directional reason for deadwood. I'm sure there are cedars that grow in a plane or a realm where the directional creation of deadwood is environmentally related, but when we go up with this, if we're saying we're going to keep length on left and right, we're saying we don't have one particular force, whether that was snow, whether that was insect, whether that was drought. We don't know the story, but we don't necessarily need to run from the deadwood based on the dialogue we're creating with our other decisions, okay? Now, as we get up here, apex, broaden this apex. This is the goal and the focal point of this effort in the upper region of the tree. If we want to broaden the apex, and this is a major discussion of apical formation for everybody here, if you want to broaden the apex naturally, we're going to compress this apex to start to pull on a greater number of branches that form the apical region. If we want to reduce or feminize the apex, we elongate and we isolate fewer branches to pull that smaller apex, compress to add more branches to broaden that apex. I think we've determined that we want to really broaden this apex as much as we possibly can. Let me just see if I can get that done. There we go. Okay, starting to broaden it. Now, when we broaden it, we still have to have those pieces carrying that length out here that give us that widening. Now, I'm going to have to reduce quite a few of the branches on the interior here to rectify some of the structural things that are going on. So I'm happy to answer questions while I do this if you guys have them.
Yeah, just a lot of commentary in the chat. Everybody's hating on movement to the left now.
Oh, wow. Not into it, huh?
No.
Wow, that happened quick.
It did. They turned fast.
You guys seriously turned on that concept. That one shift, let that be a lesson. Whenever you guys watch a stream, whenever you watch a piece of work happen, I'll do this in my demonstrations from time to time and people hate it. I'll call on people and I'll say, what are you going to take home from this? What did you learn? That one shift of that branch in, if that made the right side more attractive, you just learned something in your design process that you can take and apply to your trees. Wow, I thought I wanted to cut it off. Changing the length and changing that space and changing the visibility of the line made it totally function. When I get to that point next time, instead of not liking it and cutting it off, I'm going to change its plane and its field and really see what happens to my opinion about that piece. Okay, no judgments quite yet on the apex. Let me just work through it, all right? I wonder if we even need to go up more. There's some interesting stuff happening in here. I'm kind of trying to go up with this. But as I take these up, I think it's adding more than it's taking away. Is that adding? A little too clustery, yeah, right? So what if I cut that piece out? I got a structural flaw. I got two branches in the same spot. Okay, so we got to make a major decision right here, okay? I've got this branch. I've got this branch right here. You guys can see the foliar mass that's associated with it. Okay, that top branch. And I've got this branch right here. Let me go ahead and just, this branch. Okay, they're growing out of the exact same region. I got to get rid of one. Which one do I get rid of? Which one do I get rid of? Troy, which one do I get rid of?
Can you show the options one more time?
Okay, got this piece. That forms the very top. Okay, or I got this piece right in here.
I think the top one.
Top. Sam says top, Eve says top.
Kim says top, Rafi says lower.
So here's the thing. I do have this lateral piece back here, but I think if we want to compress, I'm gonna have to go. I think, Sam, you're on a roll you're on a roll tonight.
Thank you.
You are on a roll.
I appreciate that. I've saved it all up for tonight. Very split in the chat, though, between lower and top.
Look at that.
I think that is
Bam.
pretty great, though.
Bam. Now here's why that's beautiful. That singular piece. Number one, and let me just focus on this for Jesus. Okay? Very, what I would consider to be poor structure. Bars here, real conglomeration of growth here, nothing on the interior. Okay? And this other piece, really beautiful ramification throughout. Although in the restyling we needed to keep this, this definitely was not the piece to be kept as far as continuing the accumulation of age and I think influence of Cedrus in the design. And so by removing that now, we don't have to deal with the same limitations of compression. We now get to redistribute these pieces, not building our formal bonsai apex anymore, okay? We're working more on a scope and scale of this flatter Cedrus apex, and these are pretty wire bit in. So I'm gonna have to come back in and kind of readdress these, but I'm just gonna give us a really, really rough idea of what this is gonna look like. And when I totally polish up this apex, I'm gonna come back and we'll show you guys the finished form of the Lebanese cedar. Man, but I see that being just tremendously far more favorable for the design. Now, did we push ourselves back a little bit? Yeah, we pushed ourselves back in terms of having the refinability of it, but we saved a structural flaw from continuing to evolve and develop. We've got some branches in here that we can utilize in this space to be able to build upon that aesthetic. And now we've flattened that out. Tapping back into it, getting better and better and better. Hey, Josh, can you pull us up just a few of those images that we've been leaning on for the inspiration for this? Okay. Yeah, take me past these young guys here. Yeah, this one. This one. Okay, can you bring, yes. Okay, can you transition between the two? Okay. Oh, okay, cool. All right. He'll have it here pretty soon. Yummalummadum. Can you go back? Yeah, back to the tree in the studio. And can you just toggle a little bit for me? Between the two? And then toggle again. And then toggle again. And then toggle again. And then toggle again. Okay, last time. Come back to the studio. I think we got it. I think we got it. I think we found it. Now, what's up, Eve? Oh,
I know, I was going to say
okay, yeah, we'll come back. We'll come back to the before. Whoa. Kind of an intense, at least for me, that was intense. I don't know how you guys felt. I felt like that was freaking intense. Finding, like, what is it? What do you want? What do you want out of this design? And finding it was all catalyzed by reducing, bringing this up to facilitate that reduction with that vertical growth habit. Do I think this is in any way the finished iteration? No. Do I think we got far closer to the finished iteration? Yes. Let's take a look at the before picture. Okay, this is before. This looks like a bonsai tree. This does not necessarily look like a Cedrus. Now let's toggle to what it is now. Ah.
Wow.
I like the decisions that we made. I feel like we made good decisions. Now, some areas that I think we could improve upon. You want to show them that one again, Josh, or you feel like we've exhausted it? Yeah? Areas I see we can improve upon. These lines through here, this one being so lateral, I'm going to carry it up and then out. I'm going to raise this up and then out. And I'm going to dial in that apex for you guys. I think we got through some very, very pivotal decisions. Obviously, this lower branch, right, we can still kind of feel through whether we need it or not, or whether there's a nuance to it. The other thing I was thinking about is what happens if we just reduce it. Just reduce it, just to a little, just so we have a little something in here.
I think I'm on team keep the lower branch now.
Keep the lower branch now. Fills that negative space nicely.
Mike would like you to comment on a final pot for this tree.
Final pot for this tree. I mean, if you want to give this grand spreading impression, or you want to show height, typically the way that we execute that is a very, very shallow container. We go wider, we pull that proportion out. The rubber band theory, we take that depth, we want that same visual mass, but we want it to show greater height. We start to thin that out and widen that shape. I would love to see this in a wider, shallower container if we could execute that aesthetic. I think the oval is nice. I think there's room for a rectangle inside of this, depending on how dense we choose to make this tree. But I definitely think shallower and wider is going to be the move. Now, I don't think we go a whole lot wider than it is now, but I definitely think shallow would maximize the quality. Now, you could have a rectangle, but you probably wouldn't want the sharp corner of a rectangle. Maybe a rounded corner or a inset corner or a cut corner on that rectangle to soften that transition. But I definitely think it would be beautiful to shallow that out, really show the grandeur of that tree, the spread of that tree, and I think that's where the nuance of this tree really glows. I'm excited by what we've done. I'm excited to finish it for you guys so that I can show you that final product, because I think this is going to be really special.
That was all the questions we
That's
had?
it?
Yeah.
Ooh. Is it 8 o'clock?
7:56.
7:56. You see how we do that? Right on time. Right on time. Hey, thank you guys so much. I honestly could not have done this without you guys and your input. Invaluable collaboration, and such a beautiful way across the world, people getting together, working on a tree together and really trying to tease it out. I love how we established our foundation via that imagery and the nuances that we saw repeated in the Cedrus. I love how we continued to bring that back in. The far asymmetrical push wasn't the move. They were a little bit more centered in their presentation, even in the ancient form. We got it. The tree gave it to us. We interpreted it correctly. We put our heads together and we made something very beautiful. You guys are going to be able to see this tree on display at the Clark Collection starting again in probably mid to late November, December, or whenever Bob puts it back on display, but it's leaving Mirai at the beginning of November. You should go check it out and pay homage to that collection because there's a lot of really special pieces there. Anyways, thank you so much. I needed your help tonight. You gave it to me in every way. We accomplished something very special, and I will show you guys the finished product when we're done. Couldn't do it without you. Continually grateful for everybody and everything that you do for us. Mwah. Have a good night. We'll see you guys tomorrow.